Hi, my name is Jackson, and I'm a Destiny addict. That's how these types of conversations are meant to start, right? The Destiny franchise is something that means a lot to me. Not to get overly sensitive immediately and ruin your perception of me as some big strong man, but it truly has had a lasting impression and given me countless hours of entertainment and enjoyment, as well as getting me through some dark spots here and there. Having said that, I'm truly not sure if that's because it's a franchise of highly distinguished quality, or because, like I said in the first sentence of this video, I am simply addicted to the game design elements in the game that are designed to trigger your feel-good receptors. Regardless, whatever the conclusion is there, it's safe to say I do play a lot of Destiny. It's the game series I have absolutely played the most of, around 3,000 hours total across both entries if I had to guess, 2,200 in Destiny 2 alone. I'm an endgame, hardcore gamer, day one raider, all of those in really impressive terms. I play a lot basically. That doesn't mean I'm right about the game, but it means I have experienced a lot of it ever since the Destiny Alpha on PlayStation. Today I'm going to talk about Destiny 2 Lightfall, the newest expansion in the Destiny 2 saga, as we're now about 3 weeks behind it and I've completed most of the things within it now that the raid has been successfully conquered. I'm going to talk about this game in ways that might not make sense to you if you haven't played the game, so keep that in mind. I'll try to simplify it and not get too in the weeds about things, but it's no secret. I am very passionate about the franchise and Destiny overall, and I like talking about it and I like thinking about it, and I think it's important to be thorough about this one, because to be upfront, there's a lot of good and bad things in this package, and a lot of things that I want to explore and talk about in detail. Is the game suddenly unplayable due to Lightfall? Does it deserve a 33% on Steam? Probably not. I don't know. But I would be lying if I said this wasn't a massively disappointing entry for me personally, and it sounds like a lot of people, and it falls far short of what I would consider a good Destiny expansion. It should be noted that Lightfall also came with a price increase, which is a tired debate in of itself, but I, as a consumer and fan, would at least expect a similar level of quality content as the previous piece of Destiny expansion, which was the Witch Queen. A tall order, as that expansion is regarded by many, including myself, as having been the best expansion in the history of Destiny. I'm also going to be talking about Destiny as a package in this video instead of purely about just Lightfall content on its own. This is mostly a review about this time in Destiny and what Lightfall has brought with it, because it's a live service game. It's too difficult to decouple the free sandbox and quality of life changes from Lightfall, and I feel it's far more helpful in a Destiny review to review the game as it is, as it would be if you were just right now jumping into Lightfall at the time of release. I, however, won't be talking about Season of Defiance, as that's still in its infancy and will still take several weeks to progress and conclude, and it won't actually exist this time next year anyway due to the nature of seasonal content being vaulted with each new expansion. This video will simply be about Lightfall and the core game currently. In many ways, this video acts as a catharsis of sorts, because I don't think I've ever been more frustrated by a Destiny release than right now. So without further word vomit, here are my thoughts on Destiny 2 Lightfall as a Destiny addict, starting with Lightfall was billed by Bungie as the penultimate expansion in the Light and Dark saga. The beginning of the end, as the tagline says. Basically the story they've been building up to ever since Destiny 1 vanilla itself. This was meant to be a culmination of every story thread before it, building up to this dramatic high point in the franchise narratively. It's in the name, Lightfall. The name itself conjures up something depressing, thick with loss and grief. The way I was thinking about Lightfall before release and how they portrayed it in the marketing was that this was going to be Destiny's Infinity War moment. A great evil, the darkness and the witness finally show up after having been teased for 8 years, and this was to be the moment of our reckoning. We'd finally face up against our greatest adversaries, and I expected nothing less than to be defeated mercilessly so that the final expansion could see us succeed in the overwhelming face of our previous defeat and loss. That was the format, right? It seems to be perfectly set up for that, and this defeat would have been the most satisfying way of concluding our story. Perhaps it is a case of expecting too much, but what we got in the end did not feel at all like that. The narrative in Lightfall is beyond a doubt its weakest point. Let me lay it down for you. The Witness and the Darkness do indeed show up finally. They assault the Traveler and collect information on something called the Veil, a nebulous device tucked away on a hidden city called Neomuna on Neptune. Our character jettisons off in pursuit of the big bad, Callus, a character prominent in the lore of Destiny 2, who has now become a disciple of the Witness, basically his underling. So far, so good. This is all completely fine to me. We finally see the Witness do something of unimaginable power when it directly assaults the Traveler, and we have a direct face to an adversary in the game by way of Callus, someone through which we have a pre-existing relationship and history with, which is very important for the stakes to feel meaningful and for the back and forth with the villain to feel earned. This is all totally fine and good. Where the narrative suffers, though, is immediately upon arriving at Neomuna, just at the precipice of the story beginning. Quite frankly, to put it as simple as I can, the story just does not utilize its minuscule bandwidth in any meaningful way. What was to be a highly impactful and revelatory story about our existing cast of characters, our list of intriguing antagonists, and a story in which other deep questions in the universe that have existed for years are finally answered, instead turns into a monotonous, confusing, and boring filler arc about learning how to control a new power, and meet an entirely new cast of uninteresting characters, while an incredibly unsatisfying new MacGuffin is chased after. There are no answers to any questions here, just a tiring new list of new questions at a time when we are drowning in questions alone. It feels like an incredible disservice to the universe and everyone to spend this important time on a story that feels both inconsequential and phoned in. This was meant to be the moment in the Destiny story, the time when we experienced our second collapse, suffered a defeat we've been building up to for almost a decade now, and potentially, even more importantly for Bungie, a time when a lot of new and returning eyes in the audience were aimed at Destiny itself. This was their time to prove they knew how to land this baby, the story they had been building up to. I'm a massive fan of the Destiny story, especially in the seasons after Beyond Light and the excellent narrative the Witch Queen brought with it, but also to the deep lore, the Book of Sorrows and Unveiling to name drop a few deeper elements. And even I just don't care about anything that happens in Lightfall. Now is not the time to introduce and focus on a cast of new characters, who by the way are some of the most boring shells of walking cliches the game has ever had, which is truly saying a lot. And it sidelines literally every other character that should be present during the time when our greatest foes show up. Seriously, we don't even see the Vanguard or anyone other than Osiris and the new Cloud Strider characters at all, apart from the beginning and the end. The narrative dissonance here from the end of the previous season, where Zavala and Ikora both tell you to go spend time with your friends as there's very little hope for what comes next, compared to now when the stakes in Impact fall apart almost immediately in the Lightfall campaign, is just so impressive because I genuinely didn't think that would be possible to screw up. It's a flawed concept right off the bat. The story is simply focusing on the wrong things at the wrong time. It's no coincidence the best Destiny expansions, the Taken King, Forsaken, and the Witch Queen, all heavily focus on an antagonist throughout the campaign. It's because you need that emotional impetus and dramatic tension to create a compelling story. There's none of that here. We don't engage or interact with anyone interesting in any meaningful way. We barely at all interact with anyone other than Osiris and the Cloud Striders sometimes, and that is only to engage in 80s action hero tropes. The narrative feels entirely underbaked and almost thrown together out of desperation to pad the story. Nothing happens in the story, and even worse, it raises far more questions than it ever answers, and so it ends up feeling entirely unsatisfying. We hear endlessly about the Veil, which disappointingly turns out to just be a MacGuffin instead of something actually interesting. The narrative is simply not good here. In fact, I think it is one of the worst narratives the franchise has ever seen up to this point, and that's not solely due to the actual quality itself, which is it's still not good, but mostly because of the timing of when it has been delivered. This was not the moment to mess up the narrative. It really does undo all of the successful work of the last few years and the dramatic tension it had earned when the narrative quality slipped so drastically at the finish line. It gives me the same feelings that Game of Thrones started to give me in those final 2 seasons, and that is just simply a feeling I never wanted to feel again. So let me lay it down for you. The entirety of the story here is set chasing a MacGuffin that we learn absolutely nothing about until the post-campaign story, where we still only get the slightest bit of insight, which in the end doesn't make the narrative feel any better or actually answer any questions you have throughout the campaign. Or it's spent learning about a mysterious new power called Strand that we can mysteriously wield, which we also learn very little about. The sheer amount of time spent narratively on Strand may well be the expansion's greatest crime and weakness. There are very few actually meaningful narrative beats regarding Strand, and yet we spend an astonishing amount of the narrative time talking about it or wrestling with it, controlling it, or otherwise engaging with it. And for what reason? Seriously, it plays absolutely no role in the story other than to allow us to overcome some arbitrary light suppression technology that the main antagonist utilizes during the campaign to lock us out of certain areas. Technology that, by the way, feels like it was introduced just so Strand would have a reason in the campaign. Strand being the focus feels so vapid and devoid of anything meaningful, and it's such an uninteresting route the story goes down that's tied to more generic tropes and cliches. Like, to control this thing, you must give up control and let it flow through you. Like, come on. You may as well have said nothing at that point. It's so lazy and it all just becomes empty noise. It's such a shame that this is what the story chooses to spend the time on instead of the interesting antagonists and their deep lore, or our giant cast of existing characters with whom we should probably be interacting with during the penultimate act of a story. Nothing about this story ends up feeling like the cataclysm or the doomsday scenario it was sold as and should have been, because we spend the entire time playing with green strings and replaying action and kung fu movie tropes like training montages that drive us towards being entirely separated from the actual emotional core of what should be important. The choice to focus on Strand and the Cloud Striders, the new characters, makes the story lack any kind of impact or stakes, and it ends up feeling entirely like a filler arc, while the actual interesting stuff is happening in the background, away from us. It feels like a diversion. This is not good, and this was the worst possible time for these elements to be the focus of the narrative. I touched on the topic of cliches and tropes, but this narrative is chock full of them. We have now, in my opinion, returned to the worst elements of old school Destiny narrative. Campy and comedic relief dialogue everywhere, milquetoast uninteresting characters galore, and no substance or depth to anything that is put on the screen for you. We have gone from the deep lakes that the Witch Queen campaign and seasonal content brought to an ankle-deep puddle of shallow narrative beats that require no additional thought or dissection, or bring with them anything engaging. The biggest moment that I can immediately point to where this happens is when Rohan, the older and more gruff and slightly less annoying Cloud Strider, sacrifices himself when he is 1 day away from retirement. You took the shallowest route possible with this character unapologetically, and what's most offensive about this is that you played it off as if you expected us to actually care about it. Like, we were supposed to care deeply about this character that just died. Like, come on, we didn't know this person. We had no emotional connection with them. You introduced them 2 hours ago just so you could kill them in some Hail Mary desperate play to score some kind of emotional resonance with the audience. He talks about he only has one life in juxtaposition to our unlimited lives, and how Cloud Striders only live to be 10 years old, and those are basically all we talked to him about. Of course he was going to die. You took the most generic, uninteresting route possible and played it like it was the crescendo of the dramatic tension in the story, when in reality, the most emotional engagement I got from the Cloud Striders during the campaign in terms of narrative events was the scene before when Rohan kamikazes himself into a concrete wall. And the emotional response to that was me and my friends just laughing at it. That's it. There's nothing, nada, zilch, nothing at all interesting about the Cloud Striders or Strand as they are presented in the narrative, so why on earth was now the moment to introduce them and focus on them? This story and tone would have been perfectly fine as seasonal content, honestly, but even then, it would need a lot of work to make it compelling. It's such a miss, and it feels like such a waste of time, which again, is the worst possible thing to feel during a penultimate act because it seriously devalues the tension going into the final act. The worst thing is, even if the next few seasons pull everything together and create something compelling, you can't unwrite this narrative. It still exists. It is always going to remain a narrative weak point, and for that to be true in the most pivotal moment just before the ending is just an enormous issue. So, I could literally go on forever about how disappointed I am in the campaign's narrative. I'm just going to rattle off some additional thoughts to sum this up, just because I don't want to go on forever. I didn't want to spend much time on the bad dialogue, but it is there, and it does make you dislike the characters, and there is an overabundance of humor that just completely falls flat and feels tonally disconnected from the events that you actually experience. An example is that Nimbus calls Keital's entire race disgusting and ugly before offering to fist bump them. It's just, for lack of a better word, unlikable. No one, and I mean no one, is particularly likable in this campaign. It's also super weird that our Guardian fist bumps them back. Why make even my character unlikable? Another big thing is that contrivances happen during the plot frequently and incessantly. We spend the entire time learning to use Strand, and right at the end when it makes the most sense to use this magical grappling hook ability to save the day, and pull our ghost back from the abyss, we just don't. And a Cloud Strider instead gets to have an unearned heroic moment that feels just entirely forced. There's no agency whatsoever. Our character doesn't contribute to anything in a meaningful way. We're technically manipulated by the Witness during the events of the story, but it never actually feels like a powerful or earned plot moment because we don't have a choice in anything we do. So it's another one of those like shallow manipulations by Bungie that completely falls flat. Savathû's deception felt more earned and impactful because it was developed more thoroughly, and we had a fundamental understanding of the basis of the deception itself. But here it just feels so contrived. The deception or twist itself was that the Witness wanted us to get to the Veil so it could use our ghost as a vessel to interact with it. And it's not a satisfying deception because it feels like a reverse Deus Ex Machina, where the Witness didn't really have to actually put any effort into the deception. So what's satisfying about it? It just happens. Speaking of the Witness, I haven't touched too deep on how underused both the Witness, Callus, and our existing characters are, but you barely see any of them outside the opening cutscene, and 2 smaller cutscenes that play randomly during the game that feel entirely disconnected to the actions of our character. Another big thing, and I touched on this just a second ago, but our impact itself feels negligible in the narrative. Technically we lose at the end of the game, but it certainly doesn't feel like it. The Traveler has been killed or is incapacitated or something, and we find out via some vendor screens at the tower at the end. I mean, come on, that's just lazy. It's an amateur level of writing, and it feels like Bungie simply did not care enough about the story. Like, in the universe, our god, our source of light, apparently died, and we don't find out actually playing the game, we find out via some lines of text from a vendor screen at the end. I was so confused at the end of the game when Zavala said the Traveler was gone. Like, that's what happened? That's what happened in the final cutscene? Why is nothing explained at all? It'd be hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. There's a theory in the community that this expansion was added to pad out the series before the end, and this entry was a culmination of parts that were cut from The Witch Queen, that being Strand, and what was planned to be the starting cutscene of whatever the final expansion was to be. I don't know if I completely buy this theory, but a lot of things do point to it being somewhat correct. Strand does fit the narrative of The Witch Queen better, where collective consciousness and memory and even the color green play a much more prominent part. And the beginning and ending cutscene of Lightfall do seem to be stitched apart in an obvious way. Like, do the Vanguard and Witness just not move from this position at all while we're on Niamuna? It feels weird and again disconnected, like a campaign on a new location that acts as a glorified Strand tutorial was inserted in between an existing cutscene to buy the team time before the actual expansion. It wouldn't be the first time Bungie has pulled this stunt of pulling a narrative out of nowhere as a stopgap to buy themselves time. I just wish they didn't, as it doesn't feel additive at all. It feels reductive and damaging to the overall story. When the final shape was announced, Bungie had said they needed an additional expansion to really tell the story the right way, that there wasn't enough room to tie up the story in a single expansion. And I've got to wonder, like, what exactly did this expansion accomplish that couldn't have been accomplished if the starting cutscene and ending cutscene weren't just restitched together like it seemingly originally was? Everything in between those 2 cutscenes, all the Strand and Niamuna Cloud Strider cliches, didn't actually add anything to the story. It was entirely unnecessary, and I'm honestly not sure what they meant now when they said that it was. To sum this segment up, there is not a single thing I enjoyed about the narrative in Lightfall. Actually, scratch that. I enjoyed the back and forth between Callus and the Witness, the scenes that we got, though it did kind of devalue Callus as the primary villain in this particular narrative as well, as he's portrayed to be an imbecile instead of something that's actually imposing that we should be scared of. But the scenes themselves were engaging and enjoyable and had a few interesting progressions of the Witness's character, and I did enjoy the inclusion of Nezarec as foreshadowing for the raid villain. I enjoyed his haunting Ghost in the Machine style introduction, even if it didn't particularly make sense to me. And that's about it, really, in terms of things I enjoyed. Everything else was an enormous miss, and quite frankly, I think this has been the worst narrative package Destiny has ever received, bar Destiny Vanilla. And I am including Curse of Osiris in that. This feels far more important over time to get the narrative right than Curse of Osiris, so while Curse had less narrative content itself, what was there didn't feel nearly as impactful as the bad quality in Lightfall does. I know that's gonna be a really hot take, so let me reiterate. Curse of Osiris is definitely overall a worse package and expansion, no doubt at all, but this narrative hurt me far more than Curse ever did. It's extremely disappointing to talk about this because Destiny's narrative was in such a compelling and strong position just a short few months ago, and regression back to the standards of Curse of Osiris and Destiny 1 Vanilla were not things I was anticipating or hoping for. I really hope Bungie is able to right the wrongs here and fix the narrative over the next year and into the final shape. I feel they are, for some reason, rushing to put this light and dark saga to bed when it is simply all they have, and I think this rushed nature is a terrible choice. Like, what is this desperate attempt to start something fresh with new characters and villains and put this current narrative and story to bed when you've built up this strong narrative foundation over 8 years of development and it was finally at a point where it was getting good? Is it ego? I don't know, but if the Cloud Striders and Neomuna are the first foray into the new saga, I'm just definitely not a fan so far. Destiny's narrative has always been at its strongest when it's engaging us with these giant paracausal entities and the deep lore they bring with them. The existential dread and the wonder of what lurks behind every cosmic anomaly in the universe. To turn that around and focus instead on tired 80s action movie cliches and neon-lit chrome-infused Marvel tier superheroes is so offensively boring in comparison that it's genuinely concerning. This focus on referential tropes and themes is lazy and a waste of the universe they're being inserted into. It feels like there is an intent and focus on copying what other franchises and worlds have done before them, and in the process of doing that, they're losing their own identity in the chase. Final note, as I've talked far too long about the narrative here, but I am also incredibly confused and disappointed in the liberal retconning that is seemingly common in Lightfall. Look, I get it. 8 years of lore is a lot to keep track of, and many writers have passed through and ownership of certain elements has changed throughout time, but there are some deeply understood facts of the game universe that are played with hard and fast in the Lightfall campaign that are simply unacceptable. This is going to be super nerd mode, so be careful. Like, for example, the Vex have always been understood as having been unable to process paracausal entities like the darkness and the light and guardians themselves. They simply cannot make sense of it. That is why we are able to beat them. They simply can't simulate our light. That was also the reason as to why the Soul Divisive, a faction of Vex, were worshipping the Black Heart in the original vanilla campaign of Destiny 1. They calculated it was their best chance of survival, if they worshipped this thing that they did not and could not understand. This has seemingly been retconned in Destiny 2 Lightfall, the change being that the Vex actually created the Black Heart. Like, what? So now they can simulate paracausal elements, and in fact they can create paracausal entities? This is a giant foundational shakeup, and it simply does not feel good for these types of things to be retconned like this. I'm not going to go too in-depth about this particular thing, but Myling Games talks about it in his Lightfall campaign review, and if that sounds interesting to you, I definitely recommend checking it out. I really just don't like the raw amount of additional questions that arise from changes like this, or the lack of trust in the lore that arises because of things like this. I think it's super important that Bungie respects the lore that they've created. Changes like this seriously devalue the immersion and connection to the narrative and universe, especially when they seem to happen as a half-assed solution to untangling the lore itself. It's just not the time for these kinds of new questions to arise, because we should really be gaining a deeper understanding of the world by this point and getting satisfying answers to the magnitude of existing questions that we already have. That's why The Witch Queen was so successful to me. I felt the narrative actually provided a compelling plot that answered questions, and it provided engaging twists and added its own additional set of questions that were also successfully paid off by the end. It stood on its own 2 feet. Lightfall does not. Lightfall does not even come close. It does not feel satisfying. It doesn't feel rewarding. It's a confusing mess that left me frustrated and annoyed, as you can probably tell by now. Like I said before, this damage is done to the narrative. I'm sure they can fix things up and answer some questions over the seasons, but that will not undo Lightfall and its messy narrative, and I definitely do not trust Bungie's capabilities of providing a satisfying conclusion anymore. It's sad. The narrative was doing really well. Consistency is so important, and I thought we were finally at a place where Bungie was able to deliver consistency. Sadly, Lightfall is proof that they are incapable of being consistent. But Lightfall as a package is not all bad, which brings me to Lightfall, for all intents and purposes, is very enjoyable to actually play. and it all comes down to a bunch of quality of life updates that are long overdue, an overall increase in the difficulty leading to heightened engagement in the moment-to-moment gameplay, and an incredibly fun new sandbox tool in the form of strands to play around with. We'll start with Strand. Strand is the 5th subclass available to our Guardians, and while I have a lot of qualms about how it was handled during the campaign, not just in terms of narrative, but in how the campaign itself acts as an overdone tutorial for the subclass, where your character gets what can only be described as a tummy ache after using Strand for more than 5 minutes, I genuinely think it may very well be the most enjoyable and fun subclass in the game. It's highly mobile and frenetic, and designed with a wonderful toolset for each class that amps up the actions per minute compared to other subclasses. I main a hunter, and I'm currently rocking a fantastic build that lets me zip around with the 2 grapple hook charges I have, which ties directly into a grapple melee that instantly deletes most enemies. This spawns a tendril of Strand, which I am then able to pick up and either use as an explosive that deals large AoE damage, or, my personal favorite use, throw it away to use as a projectile I can then grapple onto and ride into the next group of enemies to continue the chain of meleeing and tangle creating. People had concerns about endgame viability with Strand due to its nature of being up close to enemies in a game where that's an instant death sentence usually in endgame content, and yeah, while it's definitely less capable than Solar for Warlocks or Void for Hunters, it's still an incredibly engaging toolset that can be brought to endgame successfully due to 2 things. The first being Woven Mail, a buff that provides massive damage resistance, allowing you to get in close and score some of those grapple melee kills without always dying. And Suspend, a new enemy debuff that literally removes an enemy from play for an ungodly amount of time. This, quite honestly, is just an overpowered and better stasis freeze effect that almost entirely makes stasis useless, but it's incredibly enjoyable to suspend a bunch of enemies and champions at a button press. Altogether, Strand has been a massive boon to the sandbox, and it's been a fresh breath of air for the game. I have almost no complaints about Strand other than how it was introduced and shackled to the campaign. I would have much preferred it have no narrative importance and have it just be straight up unlocked after the first mission, so we could choose to use it and customize it however we want throughout the campaign, instead of it arbitrarily being deactivated shortly after every part where we get to play around with it. Seriously, it was incredibly grating getting to play with this brand new tool, just to have it ripped away from you, sometimes merely 1 room away from where you first unlock it. Not to mention, this forced strandification also had a negative impact on the difficulty of the legendary campaign. Being locked into using Strand for certain sections of the campaign just felt needlessly tedious and frustrating, as you don't have access to the full aspects and fragments or grenades that really make the subclass feel comparable to the other subclasses. You definitely don't yet have the ability to make a useful build surrounding the subclass at those points in the campaign, so it ends up feeling like Strand is directly handicapping you since using Strand locks you out from using your fully built out subclasses. This was not a strong first impression for Strand, and I'd wager it's why so many people wrote it off immediately. It's a shame though, because once you exit the campaign and you start unlocking the rest of the subclass, it immediately becomes far more reliable and enjoyable to play around with. It's probably my favorite new element of the game, and it's definitely the most fun I've had with the subclass in the game at all. While we're on the topic of the campaign, let's talk about the actual gameplay. One of the strongest parts of the Witch Queen was its legendary campaign, a highly engaging and well-designed set of missions that do away with the age-old monotony of the previous expansion's campaign level progression. These new campaigns are more akin to other more traditional campaigns in other AAA shooters. Highly designed encounters with bespoke mechanics, fun combat challenges and interesting puzzles, all set in new locations each level. The leveling curve, especially on legendary mode, is designed in such a way that you don't need to do superfluous activities after each mission in order to level up enough to tackle the next one. It's a perfect system, and Lightfall is no different. While the missions do tend to feel a little less creative than the Witch Queen set of missions, I had nonetheless the same level of fun overall, perhaps even more when factoring in the addition of Strand. I don't really have many complaints to do with the levels themselves, other than perhaps difficulty in general feeling slightly easier than the Witch Queen on Legendary, but I'm not sure if I was just better prepared this time around, or if the encounters themselves were designed to be easier, I'm not sure. I would have also liked to have seen a more robust redesign of the Cabal enemies that make up the Shadow Legion we're pitted against in this installment. They don't feel at all different to the Cabal we're used to fighting at this point, beyond the new color palette and darkness resonance shields that drop that bolsters the remaining enemies at a location. a mechanic similar to the light moths from the Witch Queen. Tormentors, on the other hand, are a fantastic addition and a brilliant enemy combatant that I wish we saw even more of. These intimidating figures require tactical aiming and mastery of location, as their presence really forces you to keep moving and reevaluating your course of attack. On Legendary, they were a strong highlight, forcing my team to use communication and new strategies to overcome them, which we did achieve rather quickly, but the variety was definitely noticed and appreciated. At the end of the day, during my 2 Legendary campaign completions and a final 3rd normal completion, I simply had a lot of fun with the gameplay. It felt engaging and energetic, which I think makes it a successful campaign mode. This is also bolstered by incredible art and music and sound design, which is nothing new to Destiny. The amount of incredible art that the Bungie team produces for this game is just beyond belief at this point. Neomuna itself brings with it an entirely new angle that hasn't been tackled in the universe yet. Deep purples and blues adorn the vibrant and neon-lit cityscape, and is pulled off to great success. The ever-deep violet skies, the wind-swept crystalline sand hills on the edges of the city that glisten and shimmer, as the ridges they build up to beckon you to explore what lies just over on the other side. I was constantly at awe with the beautiful skyboxes and locations on Neomuna. My criticism about narrative tone echoes here, however, as the vibrant tone and magical hidden new city location feel at odds with what the tone at this point should be. It feels like a glittery facade, obfuscating the darker tone that I had wanted, but I can't argue with the beauty of the final result. It is an incredible looking location, from the high-tech plazas filled with neon advertisements and digitized civilians in a world of their own, to the ash-filled plaza that sits vacant and empty as Kalus's enormous ship sits on the horizon, towering above everything, existing as a proverbial fist, ready to snuff out the city at a moment's notice. It was always a pleasure to take in the sights and sounds. That's a great time to also mention the soundtrack and sound design. The team has killed it there as well. The soundtrack is wondrous and conductive, entirely additive to the experience. Moments are made better by its inclusion, and the variety in sounds and themes across each track create a varied and unique soundscape. They create memorable moments, and there are so many tracks here that absolutely just rock and sound like nothing else in Destiny, while feeling directly at home. Sound design wise, everything here also completely adds to the experience. I'm really bad at describing sounds and expounding on them, but Strand's unique sounds breathe a lot into the subclass itself, and they do a fantastic job of making you feel like you're wielding this badass cosmic fabric and contorting it into a dangerous weapon to use. Absolutely no complaints from me regarding art and sound. The teams working on these elements continue to absolutely kill it, as they have since the dawn of the franchise. The game wouldn't be nearly as successful if these teams didn't deliver industry-defining results with each and every release, with incredible visuals and sounds that invite you to explore every inch of the world, while giving you the opportunity to bask in the success that is the end product of what hundreds of highly skilled artists labored over for potentially years. The miracle that is a unified and distinct vision across disciplines being born into reality. It's an end result that is so rare and so difficult to find anywhere else. Just a fantastic job by the team. Neomuna is also densely packed with things to do. Enemy frequency is much higher than Savathun's Throne World and other locations, so while the location itself doesn't necessarily feel very large, it does make up for it with how densely it packs the things you're doing. The post-campaign exploration of Neomuna is mostly successful, with exciting rewards to be found while you explore the cityscape. I particularly like the hidden action figures that can be found by engaging with new mechanics. I don't have footage of it, but there's one action figure that requires you to collect dishes and return them to a dishwasher while avoiding angry Cabal patrons at a restaurant. These are great little diversions that reward exploration for players. I wish Destiny had more of these types of moments, because they breathe a lot into the open world part of the game. Beyond that and the post-campaign questline, there's a brand new public event style activity in that of Terminal Overload. This is an entirely acceptable and fun new activity, coupled with non-craftable farmable loot on a location daily rotator, which ensures people will be grinding it for a while to come. I find it enjoyable, but a bit on the longer side, but it's far better than Wellspring from the Witch Queen, and it's probably the best public event style activity since Escalation Protocol on Mars during Warmind. Additionally, finishing a weekly quest will provide you with a consumable that gives you access to another activity called Partition, which rotates 3 variants each week. These are, quite simply, fantastic bite-sized variable micro missions that take you into the Vex network for about 10 minutes of fun each time. Entirely enjoyable and additive to the package. I really enjoyed these and wish we could have seen more, but I'd much rather ending each season with that feeling of wanting more, as opposed to feeling as if the time and resources of Bungie could have been better spent. Now, one of the most fiercely debated topics in Destiny right now is one of difficulty. It's been mine and many others' opinion that the game has felt far too easy for far too long now, with the general activities being mostly devoid of any real type of challenge or engagement. These are your Vanguard Strike playlists, general seasonal content, and patrol locations. They have, for a long time, been steamrolled by players without any type of actual thought. It's not uncommon for people to say this is why they like Destiny, because they're just able to turn their brain off and shoot stuff. I'm in firm disagreement to this line of thinking. I mean, yeah, if you enjoy that, that's fine. But I think the game has become far too easy across the board, and outside of master content or grandmasters, it requires very little in the way of actually mentally engaging with it. The ability spam alone has trivialized content and gunplay. This has changed in Lightfall across the board, and I'm mostly happy with the results. You're now effectively always under the level of enemies in patrol and in playlist activities and seasonal content, and this has led to me using my weapons far more, which is a great feeling since Destiny gunplay is still extremely good. It's also led me to directly creating builds and loadouts for myself, even for standard content, which is just far more engaging and rewarding. My only real gripes here are that some tuning could still be looked at, for example with open world patrol spaces. I don't think the enemies need to hit as hard as they do here, and they can be tuned back slightly probably. Not too much to where they are pushovers again, but I do think it's perhaps scaled too high at the moment. Another section that I hope is looked at is the Lost Sectors. The additional Lost Sectors in Lightfall are fantastic, some of the best in the game. Bespoke environments like an arcade, each of decent length and enemy variety with unique bosses. However, they are only ever used for exotic armor farming, and the reward system itself has simply become frustrating. I would love a different reward structure for these Legend Lost Sectors, as they currently feel too unrewarding for how difficult they've been made with the updates to scaling. I think there just needs to be better drop rates for the exotic armor in the Lost Sectors, as well as a way to re-roll stats on them, perhaps from a consumable that drops from the Lost Sectors commonly. That would make that feel more rewarding for the time you spent doing the Lost Sectors. Overall though, I am very satisfied with how much more challenge has been injected back into the core game. It feels extremely good to finally have to engage with some of the deeper systems in the game, and the synergy between the new subclass systems and the mod systems and weapon loadouts has become a game in of itself. Not everything in the game has been made more difficult, however, as we'll discuss a bit later. First, I want to finish off on the things I like that have come with Lightfall by talking about the quality of life updates. There's plenty of additions here that I'm really enjoying, none more than the loadout system. This is something that I've been waiting for in-game for years now, and to see it delivered in such a competent way is such a relief. You're now able to save up to 10 loadouts, which basically saves what is in each slot and extends to things like mods, subclass setups, and even the transmog applied to the armor. The UI is quick, snappy, easy to use and understand. Really, I could not be more happy in it, honestly. It's already been such a positive to my gaming experience and streamlined a lot of the monotony in setting up specific builds for specific content. This system is a massive boon to the game, and while it's not perfect, I'd like to manually be able to name the loadouts and also have the artifact setup extend to the loadouts as well. It's still a fantastic offering out of the gate. The mod system itself has also received an update, and while it's been simplified to an almost negative degree, with a lot of much loved mods and variety removed, I'd be lying if I didn't say I loved the new mod screen itself. It's just so easy to pick up and use, and I think it's a fantastic jumping off point for future expansion, when the original mod system was getting a bit unwieldy and cumbersome. I'm more than fine with them hitting the reset button, provided they naturally add more mods with additional functionality over time to add a bit of spice. I will say there are some crazy potent builds you can currently put together which may honestly require a bit of tuning. It's currently incredibly easy to generate orbs as a strand hunter. I was routinely generating over 200 orbs throughout a Battlegrounds run, which is pretty insane when you factor in what orbs are now capable of beyond just providing super energy. Like, we get to a level where you're constantly gaining health from orbs and your ability uptime is back to pre-nerfed levels just because you're constantly picking up orbs. And yeah, it really doesn't require that much in terms of building towards it. Like, for every grapple melee kill for my Strand Hunter, that counts as a grenade kill and a melee kill, so every time that happens, which is constant, I would be getting 2 orbs from each kill, which would then feed back into recharging my grapple, which would then mean I constantly have grapples up, which means I'm constantly generating those 2 orbs, which is just nuts. One such quality of life system that didn't quite stick the landing, however, is the commendation system. This is a system where you're able to provide little ribbons to friends and teammates after each encounter, which then adds to their overall commendation score. It's a perfectly fine system in theory, especially with in-game LFG scheduled to come down the line. It's super useful to see how effective and friendly players are at a glance, and it serves as a nice reward for players who go above and beyond for their fellow teammates. The current implementation, however, is quite frankly awful. It's incredible how polar opposite in implementation the system was in comparison to the loadout system. First of all, tying commendations to character progression in the form of guardian ranks and seasonal challenges fundamentally delegitimizes the system itself by gamifying it. It no longer becomes an accurate portrayal of a person's skill or friendliness. Players are incentivized via in-game rewards to give out commendations or increase their own commendation score. We immediately saw this with the start of Lightfall, with people killing themselves in Master Wellspring ad nauseum to quickly get to the screen where they could commend each other, basically creating a commendation farm. Beyond just this, however, the system itself is buggy and often unresponsive. It's also highly over-designed with a massive amount of commendations that share the same purpose. What's the difference between thoughtful and patient and considerate, as an example? Beyond that, it's added frustration into the game when you're not commended for actually being a good player. Not that it's necessarily the other player's fault, as the screen itself bugs out, often barring you from commending. Add on to that, you're limited to commending only a couple of people in the match as well. Add on to that again the additional click-throughs you need to do on the screen to get to the scoreboard so you can see which players did what, and then click back to the commend screen again, all while a timer ticks down that'll kick you from the screen when it hits 0. I don't know, this implementation just isn't a hit for me, and it's added an additional layer of frustration to the social aspect that I think was entirely unnecessary in this way. It screams of over-designing, when the design goal simply needed to be, give players a way to recommend other players. The easiest way to fix this currently would be to entirely decouple it from player progression, like seasonal challenges and guardian ranks, but I don't see that happening soon. As it is though, it hasn't been a positive implementation, and it's a far cry from the quality of the loadout system. The final element of the quality of life updates that I want to talk about in this video are the guardian ranks. These are essentially a checklist of in-game objectives and triumphs that are designed to guide new players through the game, while rewarding existing players with a new number pursuit to chase and increase. While a noble effort, I feel that this implementation has also been a mixed effort, though not nearly as disastrous as the commendation system. I think providing new light players with a checklist of things they should familiarize themselves as a tutorial to the game is a great addition, and the system makes it far more inviting to new players currently, from ranks 1 to 5. These are super easy things like collecting gear, talking to vendors, and doing lost sectors. Where it kind of currently loses me is the nature of Guardian rank 6 and above being the de facto level for almost all veteran players at the start of each season. No matter if a player gets to Guardian rank 12, they will apparently always reset to 6 at the start of the subsequent season. It just doesn't feel entirely representative of veteran players if nearly everyone is rank 6. Coupled with the ranks being tied to commendations as mentioned before, I'm not really seeing the reason for grinding up the ranks each season if it's just going to reset. I will say though, this is far less offensive than the commendation system itself, and I can definitely see the potential here for a curated list of things to do each season or expansion drop to help guide players on their journey. I think it just needs to be iterated on a couple more times perhaps to truly add value for veteran players. So there you have it. That was a lot to talk about in terms of the gameplay of Lightfall, but I think I covered most of everything I wanted to talk about. We still have one major element to talk about, however, and that is raids are, quite frankly, the best that Destiny has to offer. Some of my favorite memories in gaming, let alone Destiny itself, are based around raiding. There is quite simply nothing like it. Grouping up with 6 friends and tackling some incredibly chaotic and challenging, mechanically interesting first-person shooter-laden encounters, all while in some of the most incredible and breathtaking areas that the game has to offer. I don't know man, raids are just special. They are and always have been the best part of the game. Friends that aren't even remotely interested in the game itself come back for each new raid. That's how impactful I think the raids in Destiny are. They single-handedly save Destiny in my eyes, with Vault of Glass offering a glimpse of what Destiny could become if we just gave the franchise a chance with Destiny 1 Vanilla's disastrous launch, and the faith has been paid off for the most part with each new raid added to the franchise. From King's Fall to Last Wish to even the smaller raid layers like Spire of Stars, these are the absolute pinnacle of Destiny content. Sadly, Lightfall's second biggest blunder for me has been the raid that released alongside it. Root of Nightmare is, quite bluntly, the most disappointing raid that Bungie has ever released. To boil it down, it was just far too easy. It didn't feel difficult, and I played it with a team of mostly lapsed players on contest mode. We finished it in 9 hours with a 3.5 hour break, so actually taking around 5 hours to complete. There's something wrong there, for contest mode at least. Contest mode raiding is meant to be the absolute hardest content Destiny PvE has to offer. I'm not exactly sure what made the raid feel so easy, because it exists in stark contradiction to the difficulty scaling that affects the rest of the expansion. How come, for example, the exotic mission feels more difficult than the raid? It doesn't make much sense. There are two things that I can directly point to. The enemy scaling doesn't feel right, and our power is too strong. The amount of damage we dish out is an extreme contradiction to the amount of damage the enemies are outputting. The combat challenge is just too lenient, and it doesn't feel like there's even an escalation throughout the raid. In fact, the greatest combat challenge felt like it happened at the beginning of the raid, which I think indicates a serious problem with how the raid was designed. Secondly, the mechanics don't change throughout the raid at all really. In previous raids, encounter mechanics have felt varied and different throughout the raid while sharing some common DNA, so each encounter it felt like you were learning something new. For example, the previous raid, Avowed the Disciple, had 4 encounters. Each felt unique and varied enough because, while most of the encounters utilized a symbol system of identifying the correct symbol as a solution for the task, the way we interacted with and thought about the symbols changed in each of those encounters. While it was strongly preferred we go back to 5 encounter raids with multiple bosses and multiple varied mechanics, Avowed the Disciple proved to me that it would be possible to create compelling content by building off of mechanics instead. It's not ideal, but it didn't break the raid in my opinion. In Root of Nightmares, however, it feels like there was no variation in the light and dark mechanic at all. It felt mechanically empty or monotonous throughout 3 of the 4 encounters, with an admittedly great third encounter that is the best part of the raid because it attempted to do something unique, and it entirely split away from that light and dark mechanic that was utilized in the 3 other encounters. Once you learn the light and dark mechanic, the entire raid can be mechanically trivialized by simply 2 players. This wouldn't necessarily be a problem in terms of difficulty if the combat challenge made up for 4 players basically doing ad clear the entire time, but as discussed, it didn't present much of a challenge on either side of the coin. I mean, look at the boss fight. It's almost a regression in terms of mechanics, even within its own raid. You're not escalating the light and dark mechanics, you're reusing them from the previous encounters to reach a DPS section against the boss, and then that's it. There's no progression there, you're not adding anything onto the mechanic, it's the same mechanic. Sure, there's a wipe mechanic, but it's entirely trivialized by not needing to utilize it because the combat challenge is so easy that you can speed to DPS without needing to avoid a wipe. It's basic content. 2 people connect the dots akin to the previous dungeon Spire of the Watcher, while 4 people ad clear. You do that for about a minute, and then DPS starts on a piece of geometry that the boss can't interact with, and there you go. There's no real DPS check, and the boss crumbles. I like that they attempted to create a new role, with Nezarec roaming the battlefield to take the fight to you, but the layout and design of the final boss encounter really does not play nice with it, and you're very easily able to avoid the enemy, or even accidentally cause them to glitch out and become stuck, further trivializing the combat difficulty. I'm not sure if Root of Nightmares was an anomaly, something that fell through the cracks in the design process that failed to uphold the core ideals of the raid content, or if it was a deliberate move by Bungie to create easier raid content itself, but it doesn't matter, the end result is something extremely disappointing to me. I know there is a notion amongst the community that every single activity needs to be accessible to everyone, and I just couldn't agree less. The fact of the matter is that we, the player base, need pinnacle content to make the build crafting and loot chase worth it. We need something to aspire to getting good enough loot to complete to feel engaged. Otherwise, the typical Destiny grind feels like it's a lot of work for little payoff. Currently, as aspirant content, Root of Nightmares fell extremely flat. To continue on with that thought, I'm fine with additional difficulty options being added for Root of Nightmares and other raids, like an adept version for newcomers and a master mode for experts, as long as the reward system accommodates the differences there, so aspirant-type loot remains aspirational. What I'm not fine with is the 1 or now 2 days per year that the endgame community in Destiny 2 gets to really challenge themselves in highly engaging contest mode raid marathons, being trivialized to chase the highest possible audience completion. Yes, I agree that it's a good thing that a lot of people attempted and enjoyed Root of Nightmares. Like I said, raids are historically the best thing about Destiny. They are the pinnacle PvE activity. They are the most creative and engaging encounters the game has to offer, so yes, it's good that a lot of people are now experiencing that for the first time. However, and this is a big however, it is a detriment if in the process of opening itself up to as many players as possible, the activity loses what has made them so special and unique in the past. It loses the why behind why so many players should play these activities if they are designed in such a way to be accessible to everyone. They shouldn't be a good jumping off. They shouldn't be accessible from the start for players. As I think I've illustrated, there should be aspirant content that requires some level of advanced game awareness, ability, and capability. The game needs activities like this. It's incredibly important to play a journey and progression. That's what creates the most engaging gameplay and the most impactful memories for players. And it's what promotes the most interesting design exploration for the developers as well. Dungeons already exist as a great starting off point for people who might want to raid eventually. They operate in that space between playlist activities and raid, and are vital to player journey as well. But to make raids a 6-man dungeon with repetitive mechanics and a decrease in challenge dilutes the pool of engaging content and brings down that ceiling for what I feel is very little gain in terms of game health. And that's honestly what Root of Nightmares feels like, at the end of the day, a 6-man dungeon. Again, it's so strange that the difficulty across the core game has been raised while the pinnacle PvE encounter has had a drastic reduction in difficulty. The raid was a massive disappointment in my eyes and really should have been far more engaging for such a pivotal moment in the game. It echoes my sentiment regarding campaign narrative, in that now was a very important time in the place and the time of the game's universe that we are now, to provide an escalation into something better than anything we've experienced before, instead of a regression into something of lower quality than we just experienced even just last year. Look, I admit it, I'm pretty negative about the raid, but it is still fun. I like the loot in this raid, I think the weapons have some interesting perk combinations, and the aesthetic of the loot pool at least, while incredibly disgusting, it is unique, and I like that aspect of it. Contest mode being off makes the normal mode version of the raid even more of a joke, but a Destiny raid has to be offensively bad to not at least be fun. And Root of Nightmares, or RON as it's called, is certainly fun. Beyond the glitchy bounce pads anyway, which were just a terrible idea from conception with how buggy the physics in the game are. The visuals in the raid are phenomenal, the lore and the soundtrack all fantastic, and I really enjoyed those aspects. I also love the raid boss being tied to the actual narrative and lore of the game, and even having him be teased directly in the campaign. I much prefer when the raid bosses feel like a culmination of that expansion's narrative. It makes the moment when you triumph over them feel even greater, so all big ticks from me there. It's just the actual challenge, and length as well. I'm not really a fan of Bungie dropping the encounter length and amount to 4 encounters, as it really doesn't feel as epic as it should. All in all, Root of Nightmares is a fun raid, but a massive decrease in quality and a bitter conclusion to Lightfall's content package. Now, we've almost entirely talked about everything Lightfall has to offer. I haven't really touched too deeply on the post-game progression, with the exotic quests and armor and post-campaign missions, but rest assured, they're mostly all great and were fun to complete, if not a little bit grindy here and there for some of them. But yeah, they were still mostly fun and enjoyable, perhaps more so than the campaign itself. But we have one last thing to talk about before we move on to the conclusion, and that is... I couldn't possibly talk about Destiny 2 in a critical video essay without being completely honest. This is a greedy game, and I desperately wish myself and the Destiny 2 audience weren't so addicted to it, so that we'd be able to stop making excuses for Bungie en masse. The monetization here is insane. The amount of money Bungie generates from this game and from their fans and through all of the different monetization avenues is, well, it's certainly had an enormous negative impact on the game. First of all, the game itself was a full standard price game when it initially came out. Then Bungie introduced Eververse, the microtransaction shop, which includes an enormous amount of content priced at ridiculous prices for the whales. That was introduced as a way for Bungie to fund their live service team and allow them to create exciting new events for the community to partake in during Destiny 1. Prices in the Eververse have steadily grown since then, and more content is being reserved for Eververse itself. Luckily, the content is only cosmetic, but I routinely argue that even cosmetic content is extremely valuable in a looter game. Psychologically, some of the most compelling reasons I've had to complete encounters and activities in the past have been for cosmetic rewards. New armor sets and new shaders, for example. Locking these behind microtransactions reduces the value of cosmetic gear earned from completing some of the hardest content in the game. Because why should I care about how anyone looks when all they did was type in their credit card details? This is like beating a dead horse, however, as Eververse has existed since 2015 or 2016, and is only getting more and more candid about the intent and pollution of the game. Beyond that, you pay for each season. Seasons are 3 months periods in the game, and honestly, this is the purchase that feels the least offensive to me. You are objectively getting good bang for your buck for seasons. $10 per 3 months of content is a stellar deal, and I have no problems with it. Destiny 2 feels far more like a live evolving world now in comparison to how it did during Vanilla or D1, and it's entirely because of seasons. On top of that purchase though, dungeons now require an additional payment or for you to own the deluxe edition of the most recent expansion. As previously talked about, dungeons are excellent bite-sized pieces of content that mimic raids. They are raid light, basically. Smaller raids designed for 3 players. They're also fantastic content, and the game has been made better for their inclusion. They used to be included in expansions or seasons, but have now been separated as an additional cost. So you would need to buy a dungeon pass to access them, or like I said, own the deluxe edition. Beyond that, remember how I said events, things like Guardian Games and The Dawning, were originally planned to be funded by Eververse itself? You can kiss that goal behind, as they've now also been monetized themselves. You can now buy event cards, or event passes for silver. Silver is basically Destiny dollars. These event passes now provide loot and rewards for that event that you can only get from the passes themselves. You can partake in the event for free, but a percentage of the loot is only available if you buy the event card for that respective holiday event, which happens once per season. So just to sum it up so far, if you haven't been keeping track, you have to own the expansions, you have to own the seasons, you have to own the dungeon key, and then you have to own the event passes if you want to truly have access to everything in the game. You did have to own the base game as well at some point, previously obviously, but that's not for sale anymore, as all of the content in the original vanilla D2 game has been deleted, so there's no need anymore. But quite simply, that's a lot of monetization for a game that also is infested with a microtransaction shop and other important features, staples of the MMO genre like transmog, changing your armor's look, being also tied inexplicably to microtransactions. Like, come on, when does it end, Bungie? We've been on a downward slope fueled by greed for years now, and I simply don't know where that money is going when you can't maintain consistent quality releases. It would be one thing if the greed fueled a better game, but it clearly does not, as you routinely let the greed sabotage you at every corner. It's not all bad though, as Bungie was acquired by Sony for $3.something billion. Billion with a B. Clearly, the financial sheet is extraordinarily attractive to Sony, and it just goes to show you that the greed is successful. Destiny is a money generator, a free money life hack, and I'm tired of people pretending like Bungie is some small indie studio who can't afford to reinvest into the game, and so we have to do our part to help them out. They're not. They're a global corporation with deep pockets. They can afford to make a truly excellent game, and it's a shame when they let their greed ruin the series' potential constantly. I'm bringing this all up in this review because I'd be remiss if I didn't comment on this expansion segment of the slide down further into quality degradation due to microtransactions. It's been years of requests from the audience for a way to skip the campaign on alt characters, because once you've done the campaign, there really doesn't necessarily need to be a reason to redo it, especially now with the option of replaying missions from a list. The audience and myself argued that it would be a fantastic quality of life update to instead be able to directly skip the campaign on alt characters so that we can start leveling them and not be forced into replaying the campaign. A fantastic idea that serves to reduce boredom and ease up other annoying restrictions you've already completed. And hey, look, Bungie agrees with you. For a price. In Lightfall, they've added new campaign skip and level boost buyables on the main screen that you can purchase once you've completed the campaign to skip ahead. Exactly what we wanted from a quality of life update, just at an additional price. This seems to happen a whole lot, hey Bungie. 7 years of asking for transmog for it to also be added at a price. This kind of piecemeal mobile tier game design is just utterly ridiculous for the prices we're already paying to engage with the game. Beyond that, what's truly offensive is the price they've assigned to this as well. $20, or about 1/3 of the Lightfall expansion retail cost to skip the campaign. Utterly ridiculous and truly greedy. I also find it pretty hilarious that they placed that much value on skipping their campaign that they created as well. It's a weird kind of self-own when you think about it. Now, in all seriousness, the reason why I so passionately detest adding monetization in the forms of campaign skips is because it increases the incentive for Bungie to design their campaigns poorly. Suddenly, ideas like, if we pad out this middle section of the campaign with some tedious tasks that increase player frustration, maybe even slightly, perhaps it would incentivize some players to skip on alternate characters. Well, those ideas become a whole lot more probable. I loathe any kind of incentive for bad game design, and this direction is a precursor of that. It's actually quite concerning considering I have no illusions as to where Bungie's priorities lie, as has been made routinely evident. Time and time again, Bungie have proved that monetization is more important than building a good product to them. They will choose the option that gives them more money, in objection to the route that builds a better game. Obviously, they are a corporation and they have a fiduciary duty to maximize profits. I don't particularly even blame them, not necessarily. But as a consumer, and also a fan of the game, I would be doing a disservice in not talking in detail about the concerning direction the game has been heading in for years post-Activision when it comes to the monetization systems. Beyond the monetization, which I feel I've ranted on about enough, I'd also like to touch briefly on the overall value proposition of the expansion itself. We're up from $40 I believe to $50 USD for these expansions with Lightfall, and while the post-game content is definitely much better than Witch Queen, this certainly feels to me like a massive reduction in quality content overall. I'm not going to say it had less content, but I certainly didn't feel the increase in quality in relation to the price increase, and in fact I'd say I received the opposite. For example, the strike in the expansion, Hypernet Current, is a lot of fun, but the Witch Queen shipped with 2 strikes. Strikes alone don't paint the whole picture obviously, but it's an indication of where corners were cut. I don't know, I just don't feel like the value has increased in proportion to the actual box cost. Definitely not so when factoring in the reduction in quality in key areas of the game. Finally, I think it's important to talk about the stagnation in both Vanguard Strikes, Gambit, and the Crucible, which is Destiny's player vs player game mode. Generally speaking, these 3 core playlists have been ignored for a long time now, and it's utterly ridiculous that with each new expansion that releases, they continue to collect dust in the forgotten corners of the game. It wouldn't be so annoying or offensive if Bungie themselves didn't consider these 3 core activities as being rituals, the core of the game basically. Which begs the question, why let the core rot? Vanguard Strikes received the most love and attention from Bungie, but it's still strikingly low effort and does very little to re-energize the playlist itself. Upping the difficulty, while good, does very little to make the playlist itself refreshing. They've also added additional battleground missions into the playlist itself, which is also good, but again, the bare minimum they could have done here. These aren't new or transformative, they don't do anything to shake up the landscape or revitalize any interest in the playlist itself. Gone are the days of Rise of Iron, where it felt like each expansion brought with it an interesting new twist to the playlist, and gone are the days of each expansion including several new strikes for players to enjoy. Vanguard Strikes, again, fare the best out of the 3 ritual activities, and I don't ultimately feel too negative about them at the end of the day. Crucible and Gambit, on the other hand, are beyond saving at this point. Gambit has not received a legitimate update since Gambit Prime, and that was shortly after Gambit itself arrived, and since then, only reductions have been made. We've actually lost Gambit maps instead of receiving new ones. The total Gambit map count has actually gone down in the years since it arrived as ritual activity. How Bungie can say with a straight face that Gambit is a ritual activity is beyond me at this point, since they are clearly dedicating absolutely no development time to the activity and it's essentially on life support. It is a nuisance to play and a chore, and I put on a podcast or video and grind it out each week for my pinnacle reward, and that's it. It's not engaging or fun at this point, but with no further changes coming, there's no saving this game mode. It needs to be put out to pasture if no changes are coming, or we need to stop tying pinnacles and challenges to Gambit because it is the same thing season to season and I'm so bored of it. Crucible, I mean, what can I say? Crucible has never been particularly fun for me in my years of Destiny, and I tend to mostly ignore it if I can, but from what I understand, it is currently suffering from the exact same issues as Gambit. No new maps, very little changes, and a pervasive feeling of the game mode being manned by a skeleton crew of developers, who have very little room to make any meaningful changes. Most of my friends who play PvP in the game or have historically have moved on to different games that feel fresher, and I can't blame them. With little investment into that side of the game by Bungie, who can blame them really? Again, I'm not the right person to be talking about PvP. I don't really play it at all, and I've never really found it to be particularly fun, as the robust nature of the sandbox and the plethora of insta-kill buttons have made it feel like a very uneven and unfun game mode to me for a long time now. I did for the most part enjoy it back in Destiny 1, but that could be because I was better at PvP back then when everyone was on console. I'm not really sure. Regardless, this is all to say that the ritual activities in Destiny 2 have mostly been either entirely unchanged or only had surface level adjustments, which means after consuming all of the new content in Lightfall, there's very little that has changed in your weeklies, and innovation in Destiny tends to be in the tentpole additions like the quality of life changes in subclasses, and not in the core game itself. Overall, back to the conversation about value proposition, I will echo what I said at the start of this video essay. I'm a Destiny addict. I'm already too far gone. I will likely play every single expansion they release for the franchise because I am so hooked to the world and the feel of the gameplay that the game itself has become too familiar for me to disconnect from my gaming time. There's been long periods of time where I've stopped playing. Curse of Osiris, Season of the Drifter, Season of the Worthy, and even Plunder last year. But I do always come back because nothing beats the feel of Destiny and the social aspect of Destiny itself, and again, I'm just too invested. That's all to say I'm absolutely the wrong person to be asking, is this game worth it? Because to me, it is. And that's even with the massive amount of negatives I've thrown at you over the past hour. That's taking all of that into consideration. Destiny 2 has given me over 2,000 hours of game time, and even pessimistically or conservatively, half of that was time I really enjoyed playing. To me, the cost is worth that. But maybe you don't want to make the time investment, or you don't want a game you'll eventually feel hooked to, or maybe you just don't like looter shooters, and that totally makes sense. This game is absolutely not worth it if you don't feel that spark. The only good thing about the game going free to play is that you're now able to jump in and try it out and get a feel for it, so that you can figure it out for yourself. I'm not upset about purchasing Lightfall. I'm upset with how core components turned out, but I've already had tens of hours with Lightfall that have been entirely positive. To me, that's worth it. For me. But I can't speak for you. Subjectively, I think this expansion has had less value overall, but the value proposition is still solid for the expansion itself. It's done enough, perhaps the bare minimum, to meet that threshold for me, but this is really a very subjective thing. What's not a subjective thing though is that this video was enormous. Around 13,000 words, 18 pages, and however long the videos turned out to be, probably definitely over an hour long at least. I sure can write a bunch of meaningless words about Destiny, huh? Feels like I almost wrote a small novella with this one. I think I've tackled everything I really wanted to talk about with Destiny 2 Lightfall, and even summed up my thoughts on if I'd recommend the package itself in the last section. So I'll quickly sum it up once more concisely. Lightfall is a disappointing expansion in many ways, mostly in terms of narrative, but in others it expands upon the fun with an interesting new subclass and makes the game easier to play with a plethora of quality of life adjustments. For a price increase of $10, the sting is there, but overall Destiny fans will find enough here to enjoy, and newcomers won't be too disappointed in this one. It really is just such a shame that the narrative and raid was such blights on the experience, because they are what I was most looking forward to. I'm not sure where Bungie is heading for the final shape, but I would be lying if I said I didn't feel extremely dejected and far more nervous about the final installment now after seeing the quality dip yet again. As a fan, it's so frustrating that Bungie just can't seem to find a consistent level of quality that they are able to deliver on. Each release feels like it's a crapshoot. Are we going to get a Forsaken, or are we going to get a Shadowkeep? This time, we mostly got a Shadowkeep. It makes it very hard to get excited about upcoming releases when you don't know. I finally was getting to a place after The Witch Queen and the seasons before and after where I felt like they had found their stride, that they knew how to deliver, and I was fairly confident Lightfall was going to be incredible. But again, then that lack of consistency hits like a whirlwind and you're left confused as to how we got here. Anyway, that's Destiny 2 Lightfall. I still suck at ending videos, so I don't really know what to say. Thanks for sticking around and watching this entire thing, if you did. I've been writing it for about a week now, and it's been a massive source of catharsis for me, so I've really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. Sorry if you're not a Destiny fan and this all made no sense to you. But hey, if you are a Destiny fan and you had similar or vastly different thoughts to me, I want to hear from you below. My question for the comments below is, what has been your favorite and least favorite expansion of the Destiny franchise, and where does Lightfall sit for you? My favorite, probably the Witch Queen. I just feel like it delivered such a strong narrative, and the build-up and payoff was so satisfying that it really felt like everything I was looking for in a release. My least favorite, either Curse of Osiris or this one, honestly. Objectively, Curse is worse, but it was also far cheaper and less disappointing to me because Lightfall had so much building up to it that I think its quality issues feel far more impactful to me than Curse's ever did. But yes, objectively, Curse was worse. Okay, anyway, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, do the things every other video maker on the site says to do. Share it around with people who like extra long video essays on games. And hey, if anyone from Bungie is listening, let me know. Would love to know if this video reached anyone there. Anyway, that's it. Bye.